I am looking for attendees. They are joining and the numbers are clicking up as I look. We'll just give people a few more minutes to join and I will set up the screen for sharing. There are currently 38 attendees. Thank you all for joining. I'll just give you one more minute and then we'll get started.
You're mute.
Yeah.
Come in here.
Well, it is 1:02. I will give people a couple more minutes. There are 48 attendees. According to Katrina, we are expecting over 80. So I'll just give a few, one or two more minutes for people to join. It would be a shame if people missed the beginning. Please bear with us. Alrighty, in the interests of time, I will open today's meeting. So thank you very much for everybody who has joined us today. Today we are facilitating a discussion on clinical trials. We have invited a range of health consumer organizations because for us and for you, clinical trials are one of the most important things in our healthcare system. They facilitate early access to medicines, breakthrough treatments, and as you will hear from the speakers that we have convened today, are a very important part of the healthcare journey, not only for those of us who live in metropolitan areas, but also those of us who live in rural and remote areas. We also see that COVID-19 has had a massive impact on our healthcare system. Some of it has been for the good and some of it for the, we're not quite sure, quite as good. And so some of those discussions will be had today. So welcome to everybody who's joined the call. I can see there are 57 attendees at the moment, so thank you very much. Just some housekeeping to start with. If you can all stay on mute while the panelists are speaking. If you have any questions, pop those into the chat function and we will facilitate a question and answer session at the end. In the interests of time, we don't have all that much time, so I will give an introduction and then I will hand to the lovely speakers that are with us today. So this is our agenda. Today we are going to be joined by Sarah Looms from Novartis, who will give you an overview of how the pharmaceutical industry has managed clinical trials during COVID-19. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us. We will then ask Professor John Zalkberg to look at what's changed from a technology and policy perspective since COVID-19 began. Professor Zalkberg is the chair of ACTA, the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, and has done a lot of policy and advocacy work in the space of clinical trials and has partnered with patient organisations as well as industry. And then we need to look, most importantly, from the patient and carers perspective. What do clinical trials mean for patients? How has COVID-19 impacted on that? And we will be hearing from Richard Vines, the CEO and founder of Rare Cancers Australia. We have nominally allocated some times for those discussions, but we have been amusing ourselves with the reflection on the fact that Richard has 5 slides for his 15 minutes and Professor Zalkberg has 20 slides for his 15 minutes. So we will try and get everything done because I know that these expert speakers have really important things to discuss with us today. So the objectives of the webinar from our perspective are really to assure patients and participants in clinical trials that Australia is open for business. There are measures that have been put in place during the past few months to try and ensure continuity and safety of patients who are enrolled in clinical trials. We do know that there have been challenges from that perspective from both hospital, jurisdictional and national levels. But we do want to provide this opportunity to talk about what those challenges are and see if there are other things that we can do. And we also want to provide you with an opportunity to see how we can enhance your understanding of the importance and value that clinical trials bring to the Australian patient population. We do believe clinical trials play an important role in Australia's healthcare system. They are part of the journey to new innovative treatments, and we see that in the media every day as people are investigating new treatments for COVID-19 and indeed new vaccines to ensure that we can combat this healthcare crisis into the future. But we also know that there have been extraordinary advances in medicine over the last 2-3 decades that are seeing people live productive and full lives even when they have faced catastrophic diagnoses. And so clinical trials play an important part of that in providing early access to life-saving medicines, in training our healthcare professionals in how to use new medicines as they become available, and also providing Australia with an opportunity to participate in international scientific thinking. They also provide, and it's the last point there, jobs. So we do see clinical trials as an opportunity for Australia because we are relatively COVID-free. We have a very strong healthcare system. They are an opportunity to create infrastructure and jobs for people who not only in the healthcare setting provide clinical trials, but also all of those support networks that support clinical trials and healthcare provision. We have seen disruption in clinical trials during COVID-19. Some hospitals were very concerned about having non-patients attending their hospitals, which made it difficult for the staff who were running clinical trials to attend those clinics. We did see that industry made some decisions to pause recruitment into new clinical trials, and that new trials were not started because of the complexities of managing the COVID crisis in the early days. And the overarching focus was on patient safety. Some patients who are in clinical trials are at their most vulnerable in their health state, and we did not want to expose patients to this new virus that might have catastrophic impact on your healthcare. We do know now, though, that Australia is back up and running, and as you can imagine, Victoria less so, but other states are running clinical trials pretty much as they were before COVID started. It's really important to emphasise this sector and the role that it plays, and also the devastating impacts of pausing or halting or changing the way clinical trials are being run, particularly for patients, those patients who were already starting a clinical trial. What was the impact on them, and how did it impact on their ability to feel safe and confident in their care. We as an industry and as a sector have tried to improve communication between sponsors and the clinical trial sites. We've initiated far more remote measures, including remote monitoring of medical records, and virtual meetings have become our new normal. We've seen the introduction of telehealth by the Australian government, supported by the industry, and we've seen an uptake of teletrials, which is something that we strongly support. It is interesting, there are a number of things that COVID has forced us to do, as both a sector, patient groups, clinicians, hospitals, and the industry. And now we're looking forward to how we can optimize those into the future. Now, I would like to hand over to the first of our speakers, but I would just like to reiterate, if you do have questions, submit them into the chat function, and we'll come to those at the end. Patrina is monitoring the chat function as well, and she'll help me not to miss anything important. I would now like to hand over to our first speaker, which is Sarah Looms from Novartis, who will talk about how the pharmaceutical industry has managed clinical trials during COVID-19 from her role as the Novartis Clinical Study Manager. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for having me, Liz. Today, I am going to give a brief overview of how the pharmaceutical industry, and specifically Novartis, has managed so far in the COVID-19 pandemic. As Liz mentioned, bringing clinical trials into Australia is incredibly important to give patients early access to these novel treatments and to also give our healthcare professionals experience with them. Ensuring that clinical trials are opened and completed on time helps new medicines come to market safely and give patients options for treatment. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Novartis globally has contributed $40 million to 60 local support projects, which includes grants to patient organisations in Australia. And along with other pharmaceutical companies, we have partnered with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on the COVID-19 Therapeutics Accelerator project. So if I could just get next slide, Liz. So now I want to talk specifically about some of the things we are doing in Australia. Australia is a key destination for global drug development at Novartis. We have a significant commitment to Australia and to the Australian medical community. Novartis invests around $30 million per year into Australia by way of clinical trials. And currently we have a team of over 50 staff working on 101 ongoing trials at over 300 clinical trial centres. We have 600 patients on active treatment and follow-up. Even during a year when a lot of activities have been on hold, we have been able to enrol 74 new patients this year, and actually about 40 of those have been since March, when most of the country was put into lockdown. One thing that I do want to highlight here is that over the past 6 months on the Novartis clinical trials, every clinical trial patient had ongoing care and treatment available to them. So if I could have the next slide, Liz, please. Within the Novartis clinical development team, we actually held our first pandemic meeting at the end of January. The type of work that we do means that we are natural born planners and we like to be very prepared. So learning from our colleagues in China, we laid some excellent groundwork in February to ensure that when the restrictions did come into place, we activated our pandemic plan immediately. So with that plan in place, we were able to maintain patient safety and the scientific integrity of the trial data. We focused on two key areas, that was supporting our clinical trial centres and supporting the patients. For our ongoing studies with active patients, we were ensuring that we communicated effectively and succinctly as our priority. Our study monitors, they're our team members who oversee the conduct of the trial at individual centres and hospitals, were available to check on the progress and ensure patient safety and quality were maintained. They were also on hand to identify and help solve any of the challenges that arose. As we all know, airline travel around the world stopped almost overnight. Unfortunately, most commercial flights are also filled with cargo, which includes our clinical trial supplies. So our supply chains were mostly delayed and in some cases completely shut off. So for our clinical trial drug stock and treatment options in particular, we were able to request additional supplies in February to have a surplus sitting in our depot here in Sydney. And in some of those cases, we shipped extra stock out to our centres to ensure that their levels on site and in the hospitals and clinical trial centres were sufficient to cope with their patients. Now, traditionally, when we open a new clinical trial, we would have 2 or 3 Novartis representatives visit the clinical trial centre in person, and we usually conduct about a half-day training on the running of the trial, providing information about the treatment and how the different aspects of the study would be run. Now, in lockdown, we have actually been able to conduct almost all of that remotely. We've actually been able to open 14 new clinical studies since May of this year, and we have been using remote technologies, and we've had an excellent uptake and engagement from our clinical trial centres, which has made a massive difference. So one very simple example of using these electronic measures is that we have implemented electronic signatures on our clinical trial contracts. And that has been saving on average 2 weeks, eliminating couriers and potentially the very rare occurrence that, that mail goes missing. And if we look at our 100 clinical trials, adding an additional 2 weeks gives us almost 2 years of additional recruitment time across all of our portfolio, which is a big difference. If I can get the next slide, please, Liz. Now, to how Novartis and other companies, we've all worked similarly, have worked together with our clinical trial centres to ensure our patient safety, while still ensuring that our safety data is valid. Many of you will be familiar with telehealth. We've all spent a lot of time now on video calls from birthday parties and speaking to relatives. But of course, in the context of clinical trials, we are now using that as a way for the study doctors and nurses to check on the patient's progress and safety remotely. Some of the major teaching hospitals also have nurses who can travel to patients' homes where they can administer trial treatments, care, and some of their tests. If the patients were unwilling or unable to leave their home for some situations, we were able to use local laboratories as well to continue to have those patients have their safety monitoring. Now, as I mentioned before, supply chains were difficult to navigate, but the last piece of the puzzle is getting that study treatment from the hospital or the centre to the patient. And there were a number of approaches that we were able to use. Some of the centres use like a drive-through, no contact method, but we were also enabled a courier service at Novartis to deliver either to the patient's local pharmacy, who could then check the drug on arrival, or directly to the patient's home, depending on how the drug was administered, obviously. If I could get the next slide, please, Liz. Now, we have overcome a lot of challenges, as has the rest of the world. Even in Australia, COVID-19 has presented challenges to keep our trials open. We haven't been as impacted as other countries, so that gives us a good opportunity. We can continue to keep COVID-19 under control, so our clinical trials continue to move ahead, and we have a relatively minimal impact. It is a very competitive market, so this is a good news story for us. It is an opportunity for us to step up and keep new medicines moving forward. And then if they prove to be efficacious and safe, then we can become available more broadly around the world. So just to recap, Novartis is very committed to Australia, and all sponsors have been right on the front foot to manage the situation to ensure the safety and continuity of the patients. As long as we continue to manage the COVID-19 situation as well as we have been, we're in the position to continue to progress worldwide development of new medicines. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That's really fascinating. And I think if we can extrapolate, the number of clinical trials, the number of centres, the number of patients who are benefiting from Novartis trials, and then multiply that by the number of companies in Australia, we can see that there is extraordinary value for patients to have a thriving and growing clinical trial sector. It's why we all work together. It's one of the important things that we do, and it's one of the reasons why we have asked Professor John Zaltberg to talk to us now about what has changed, particularly since COVID-19 in terms of technology and policy, and probably to challenge us with a few difficult questions as well. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Liz. Can you hear me okay?
A little bit broken up, but see how you go.
See how we go. I've got the phone back up in case. Okay, next slide, please. So I just wanted to make a few comments that are a little bit broader than clinical trials. So clinical trials are the way we practice medicine, but I wanted to highlight what COVID has done, which is changed a number of aspects of medical care, which I think we just need to reflect on in terms of what these mean. And the principles of COVID were really threefold, I guess: protect the safety of staff, protect the safety of patients, and protect the safety of the community. Those might sound like motherhood statements, but when you start to ask the question, is one of those more important than another? If you have to focus on one, which one do you do? Is it the community first, the patients first, staff first? If you don't have staff, how do you manage patients and the community health? These are somewhat complex issues, and I'm sure they'll play out over time. Next, please. The results, however, of COVID have introduced, I think, a number of risks for us that people just need to be thinking about. So for example, treatment started to be changed in the COVID era because of access to hospitals and various treatment facilities. Some doses were reduced, worried about immunosuppression. Some treatments were delayed, some were prolonged. There's the risk of making medical decisions about the value of treatment rather than asking patients about the value of treatment, and indeed minimizing the importance of these life decisions in certain subgroups. So for example, in France, early in the pandemic, the statement was made that nobody with metastatic cancer should be treated, which is hard to believe that this is the level of panic, I guess, that medical systems reached. But in the context of those sort of changes in the overarching medical system, you can see that the reflecting on trials is one part of a complex series of processes that need to be considered. Next slide, please. Unproven therapies, and what I mean by unproven therapies here is that we started to reduce the doses of radiotherapy. We started to use radiotherapy and chemotherapy differently. Now, I'm a cancer physician, as some of you will know, and clearly these sorts of issues, they weren't alternative in the sense of, or unproven, if you like, in the sense that we knew that radiotherapy may work, but now we started to reduce the dose. We started to reduce the duration and so forth. The COVID made it quite difficult to evaluate patient status. So I'm still doing telehealth consultations. Some people can't manage video, but even on video, it's not easy to understand people's social state. It's not easy to arrange pathology testing in a way that allows you to manage results over time and so forth. And then, of course, I think we still don't understand the risk of all the downstream impacts, which are going to be difficult to measure for some time. The medical students are in the middle of this, registrars who are undergoing training, and of course, just the routine care that I discussed. Next slide, please. This is a slide now, which is, I think, published in April or so in the Lancet, but it just shows you what happened to the new cancer diagnoses. So these are the all sites, the blue line, this is the red line is skin cancers, and as you can see, I might try and dial in by. Liz, would you prefer I dialed in by phone, or is there's a message about having trouble understanding me?
I'm happy to pause for a minute while you try that, John. It is a little bit tinny in the sound.
Let me quickly try it and see how we go. Just a sec. My apologies for this. I just find the number to dial in with.
Maybe switch the video off, John.
Okay, I can definitely do that. Does that help at all? Or?
Yeah.
It's a little bit better. Try that.
Okay. So this slide is just to show you the decrease in the number of new diagnoses of cancer made during the period. This is the vertical bar here is the first confirmed case of COVID in the Netherlands, and you can see that the number of diagnoses being made fell as a result of the COVID pandemic. Next slide, please. I think there's the COVID also risked the changes in our ethical framework, and both as individuals and as society, how we value people of older age and how we consider their healthcare. And then, of course, to the topic of today, the risk to clinical research frameworks. There were hospitals and institutions early in the piece which said perhaps we shouldn't do any research. There was some ethics committees closed all trials around the country. Some kept some open. And again, then the question is, which trials should you prioritize? And how do you manage recruitment management of investigational products and so forth. Ethics committees we've talked about, and the reallocation of resources is implicit in this discussion. Next slide, please. Just some piece of data. Many trials were suspended or terminated, as I indicated, and at least one publication indicated that as of mid-May, nearly 100 companies and 240 trials had experienced disruptions. Now, clearly, there are many more companies, there are many more trials than 240, but it does give you a sense of the magnitude of the issue. Next slide, please. On the other hand, there was an explosion of COVID-19 trials, and there are over 100 various projects listed in Australia around treatments, diagnostic tools, data modelling, and of course, the impact of COVID on mental health, Indigenous health, and so forth. Next slide, please. There was indeed, I think, an increased collaboration and cooperation between clinicians, between industry, with trials networks, and an adaptation of existing trials in the COVID-19 era as well. Next slide, please. This slide's a little bit hard to read, I'm sorry, but it was a survey done of members of Research Australia. There were 1,200 people that completed the survey, and at least 3/4 of them had some link with the clinical space. And this is their estimate of some of the initial impact of COVID-19. So you can see 51% of them thought there'd be research couldn't be undertaken remotely, unable to recruit participants to research trials was 49%. The international travel restrictions, I won't go through it, these slides will be available later, but it just illustrates the initial considerations that people had when impact of COVID-19 was just beginning to be understood. Next slide, please. This is the impact that people felt would continue beyond 2020. And again, you can see here delays in project milestones. Nearly everybody felt that would be a risk. Publications, a reduction in funding, reduction in new research funding. But again, the list goes on, loss of staff, nearly 50%. So really, these considerations are something that we need to reflect on and perhaps not wait for them to happen, but predict what may occur and see whether we can put in strategies to avoid them. Next slide, please. However, there was some consideration about what some of the enduring benefits might be. So this, a third of people felt there would be increased collaboration within their own organisation. Roughly a third thought there'd be improvement in ethics committees procedures. So a number of these sort of potential benefits that we may see in an enduring way from COVID, but again, it's not. None of them have, the views of an overall majority. And again, we need to think about what the improvements should be and could be in the future. Next slide, please. In terms of policy, and that's what I'm supposed to be talking about, and not spend too long talking about other things, but I think the first thing that I really highlight for us to reflect on is that perhaps for me, the most important thing that was obvious out of this is the lack of policy. And I refer to the fact that routine healthcare has stopped is perhaps too strong a term, but every state in this country has a pandemic plan. The federal government had pandemic plans. They're all tested. And yet here we have our first pandemic and routine healthcare stops. There was some, that for me is a failing, but again, an opportunity. However, there were a number of good things. The national medicine stockpile was seen as a resource for trials, and the government prioritised access to the supplies for clinical trials. Next slide, please. There was a joint statement by the NHMRC, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, the Clinical Trials Reference Group to provide guidance to institutions, just pointing out that the conduct of research in COVID is a significant priority, but the initiation and continuation of other ongoing and proposed research is also critical to the well-being of patients. Next slide, please. The Minister talked about we are moving to this a clinical trial harmonization across states, and something that we've heard about for some time, the national front door. I think we're still trying to understand the front door and where the key is, but nevertheless, he did make a public statement about the national front door, which may come up in discussion. Next slide, please. In terms of more about technology, and of course it's partly policy as well, remote monitoring and teletrials have been referred to, and I won't spend too long on these. Next slide, please. But remote monitoring, I think, has enormous opportunities. I think that it's not universal. There are still a number of major centres that won't allow remote access to the medical record. Nevertheless, there is enormous opportunities. I think we can't achieve this through COVID. I guess we are going to struggle, but there is enormous opportunity to use remote technology to improve clinical trials, whether it's monitoring of trial documents, whether it's data source verification, and so forth. Next slide, please. Remote monitoring is not new. This is a paper I was involved in publishing. It was published in 2013, so seven years ago. The work started 2 years before that. And this basically said at the time that we could use remote monitoring to access medical records and do the work of replace the manual remote monitoring that was occurring. I'm grateful, at least that, well, not grateful, but at least COVID-19 has stimulated this across the board. Next slide, please. Teletrials, certainly in the oncology community, there's been a lot of interest in teletrials. I don't think this is used widely outside of oncology, but I do think that COVID-19 will stimulate the interest in using teletrials. We're well along the way of making this part of the written considerations for sponsors and for institutions and practices as to how we can get involved in clinical trials. Next slide, please. There's a growing demand for, if you like, remote monitoring where we can do trials at home. We can remotely monitor patients and do trials with people in their own environments. This is, obviously just an example from the internet, but the idea that we can not only manage patients at home, but actually do trials while people are in the comfort of their own homes and without travel, I think brings enormous opportunities for the future. Next slide, please. There are some barriers. I think there still needs to be further investment in clinical trial infrastructure. I think there's still, we've still got if you like, a federation system. I just wanted to, so for example, remote monitoring is likely to come about in New South Wales. I'm less optimistic about Victoria. And I heard recently that in terms of telehealth, which is a great step forward, one hospital had 7 different software programs to manage telehealth for their patients. So if you were a patient of that hospital and needed an orthopedic consult, and then you needed to see the oncologist, and then you needed your blood pressure or see a cardiologist, you'd be trying to learn 7 different systems. That's within one hospital, let alone going across the states. Next slide, please. In terms of some of the barriers that from a rapid research response, at least this was the view of these 1,200 researchers that I mentioned before, very significant financial impacts of COVID-19 funding processes. So there are still a number of barriers, but again, I think being able to highlight these in this way is an opportunity to think about how we can at least understand these and perhaps deal with them moving forward. Next slide, please. So I've gone through these in record speed, Liz. I just wanted to, I'm sorry if it was too quick, but just to give you a feel for some of the issues that I think about when I think about these last 6 to 8 months. And finally, these acknowledgements. This has been, notwithstanding that it's easy to sit here at a conference and criticize or say not everything's worked, it's been an enormously difficult period for everybody. And I think we just need to acknowledge that we will get through this, and then we will benefit as a result at the end of it all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And I certainly wasn't criticizing the number of slides. It just highlights what a complex area it is and how many things need to work together in order to deliver the kind of expectations that we have of our healthcare system, including, as you say, the federation, which if I was king for a day, I might unwind to try and get some harmonization, not just in clinical trials, but in other things across the states and territories. But that's a different conversation. There are some questions coming through on the chat, so I'll look forward to those, but be prepared, John, there will be questions on the telehealth and how others can benefit from those. I'd now like to ask Richard Vine, CEO and founder of Rare Cancers Australia, to come and talk to us about his experience from the patient and carer's perspective on clinical trials. Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Liz, and good afternoon, everyone. And someone let me know if my audio is crackly, but I'm hopeful it's going to be okay. I thought I'd just briefly tell you, one slide on Rare Cancers Australia. I'd like to talk a little bit about clinical trials, and I'd like to talk about the case study, and then we can get rid of all that and get into a robust Q&A, hopefully. So next slide, please, Liz. We were founded, and the reason that I wanted to do this is because of my co-founder, Kate, who will take some prominence in this presentation. Kate is the reason that we set up Rare Cancers Australia, and she's a 30-year survivor of medullary thyroid carcinoma, and I'm currently in Sydney, and she is currently just down the road at Royal North Shore Hospital because she is on a clinical trial for her disease, and there have been some complications, so we had to bring her in from regional New South Wales for tests and examination, and hopefully some progression, and that will inform a lot of this presentation. The fact that we're not living as much as the work we do, and there's a lot of the Rare Cancers team online today, and as much as we do a lot of work around with patients and clinical trials, there's a personal element to this presentation which we'll get to as we go forward. We have 15 staff. We work across the community. Our primary focus always is patients, and either whether we're caring and trying to support them, or whether we're advocating on their behalf. That's what we do, and it's what most of the people on this call do. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Liz. I think the point that I want to make here is that we run clinical trials in Australia for a whole variety of reasons. We obviously run it to increase scientific knowledge in some circumstances. We run it for, one of the benefits we get out is an elite trained bunch of clinicians who are at the sort of cutting edge of new care. We need to run trials in this country because of the complicated nature of our registration and reimbursement process. As distinct from the US, registration here just means that we then get of a drug as being effective, as you all know, just means we just get in a queue then to see if we can ever get it funded. And that takes a long time, and that brings to the fore the very real element that sometimes gets lost in clinical trials discussion. And that is a statement that I can certainly attribute to Professor David Thomas, but I've heard it from other clinicians that increasingly clinical trials are standard of care for a lot of patients, and in my case, for rare cancer patients. There is, and if I go back to Kate, there is currently no reimbursed therapy for medullary thyroid carcinoma on the PBS. So the only option that Kate would have had was for us to fund a drug or to be on a clinical trial, which she is. And I think we don't want to lose sight of that, because if we suspend recruitment into a clinical trial, it's a denial of care. It's not a safety precaution for someone who might or might not contract COVID when they go into a hospital. This is saying to, in my case, a cancer patient, no, you can't have any more care. And that's a much more profound decision than I see often discussed. And I think it's a real question as to whether COVID-19 is a valid reason to do this. We would not do it with a patient who was on, we didn't close the VCCC, or we didn't close Chris O'Brien Lifehouse for patients who were not on clinical trial regimes, but are on sort of other standards of care. And I think we need to reflect quite seriously on what we're denying people, whether we're not recruiting new patients, whether we're suspending care. It is a tragedy that when that doesn't happen, people die without options for treatment. Next slide, please, Liz. So I guess a really good question is, why did it take a pandemic to introduce remote monitoring? When Kate was pre-COVID, Kate went on her trial in Q4 last year, and we were regularly going up and down, and I'll talk about this a bit more, but we were going up and down to Sydney for appointments and meetings and scans and blood tests and what have you. And as soon as COVID came along, we didn't have to drive 2 hours, spend 1 or 2 nights in Sydney. We suddenly found that we had perfect capabilities in the Southern Highlands to do all of those things. And for us, our circumstances are such that that is not incredibly burdensome. But for a lot of people, you know, being a lack of sensitivity on the part of people who run trials and the way that they're structured to the needs of patients. You know, I always remember being told by a social worker at Westmead that one of the great barriers to people turning up for chemotherapy treatment was that they didn't have the bus fare. And how would that relate to someone trying to get all the time to hospitals to do things? So I think there's a need to take a positive lesson out of that and try to be a little bit more flexible and a little bit more patient-centric about how we do this stuff. I think the other thing that we've observed is that clinical trial coordinators are not carers or case managers. They're there for a metric reason, if you like. And so it raises the question of who's looking after the patient. And we have this discussion internally, hugely, and particularly when you get to remote and rural, in our case, in the Southern Highlands, where we're looking at what's the relationship between the people running the clinical trial who are treating a patient and their local GP or referring specialist. And the answer is, it's pretty remote. You know, there's a letter that might fly past and a copy of a scan, but not necessarily a discussion that would allow the local clinician to seriously engage and monitor and be almost a case manager for that patient. And that creates further problems if the patient progresses. Where do they go then? They're no longer part of the clinical trial. And I know that there are sort of, you know, standard answers to all this, but when you're living it, they're not being realized. And I wonder if we shouldn't have formal briefings between a patient's GP and the people running the clinic, the investigators running the clinical trial, to say, this is the treatment regime, this is what's going on, these are the potential side effects, this is what you're looking for, this is when you need to contact us. This is not going to take 2 days to do this. This is a 5 or 10 minute phone call that makes sure that there's a communication channel between the local caring GP and the people running the trial, because it's very easy for the patient to get lost as almost, and I don't want to be unnecessarily provocative, but it's very easy for them to end up as a scientific specimen rather than as a patient, and that's what we have to avoid. So next slide, please. This is Kate's story. She's as I said, she's a 30-year survivor of medullary thyroid carcinoma. She progressed last year, so she's on a clinical trial, a company-sponsored clinical trial run out of Royal North Shore. She was coming up bi-monthly for scans, and initially it was monthly. And the switch to remote monitoring was at our instigation. We sat there and I said, you're not going, when Sydney was dubious at best, I said, you're not going there unless you absolutely have to. And we rang, and yeah, of course you can. Of course you can do blood tests in Bowral, and you can do scans in Bowral. And so suddenly we didn't have to go into that hotbed of disease, otherwise known as Sydney. And that was really a good thing. And we started to try to do teletrials. And the one point I'd make, and and I understand whenever we talk to and about clinicians that some of this is not easy, but there needs to be a realignment of people doing teleconsultations, that it's simply not good enough to be late, to be unreliable, to be lacking punctuality, to wander off, because patients are not sitting in a waiting room, at least if you're in a waiting room, you know you don't have to go home until the doctor sees you. But if you're waiting for a telehealth call to happen, and I walk into the area where Kate's going to take the call at the time it's happening, and she's sitting there silently reading or doing whatever, and then I come back 45 minutes later and there's been absolutely no communication, and we finally initiate contact to find out that, oh, maybe it'll be tomorrow, maybe it'll be later. That's a completely unacceptable way to treat patients, and it's not unique to Kate. I know that because we talk to a lot of patients. So I think that if you're going to have telehealth, it's not like a waiting room. The patient is sitting out there in no man's land and they need to be respected. And it doesn't take too much on anyone's behalf, be it a coordinator, a secretary or whatever, to send a text and say, this is the time's moved back, we're doing it. So I think the other element that goes back to this idea of a general practitioner or someone looking after the whole person is when Kate progressed, then she started to have fatigue, and then she started to be breathless, and it turned out that she was having, we subsequently worked out that, or they worked out that she was having mild heart failure, and all of a sudden there becomes a challenge about how you introduce other specialists, how you introduce other therapies, what drugs are conflicting, what drugs are not conflicting, and the complexities are enormous. And I think that without a case manager and with a heavily overburdened investigator, then patients can feel really, really uncomfortable in the process. And I just think that as patient groups, as for all of us who do this and we look after patients, we maybe need to raise our voice and say, you know, it's not a scientific experiment anymore. Clinical trials are standard of care. There are patients at the center of it. They're not specimens. They're not test modules. They're people. And you can't just suspend because it gets uncomfortable, because you wouldn't suspend normal standard of care. And we need to build a sensitive, patient-centric structure. And next slide, please. I think that's it. Yeah. And a patient on a clinical trial, to paraphrase our catch cry, that rare doesn't mean you're alone, then it being on a clinical trial doesn't mean you're alone. And we need to be loud and proud about that as patient advocates. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And I'm sure I join with all of us who know you and Kate. Please send our love to Kate, and our thoughts are with her, and I hope she is doing okay.
Thanks.
I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'm going to turn to some of the questions now, but if I stop sharing the screen, you should be able to see our panelists more clearly. I'll ask John to come back on video so that we can see you. Thank you. There are a couple of questions already in the chat, and we'll see how we go from there. There's a couple of questions around teletrials, and I'll start with John, but Richard may also have a view, particularly as teletrials were introduced in the oncology area. How do we, where's it gone? There we go. How do we get more information on the national teletrial model, and how can we embed teletrials as a collaboration to ensure that it can happen to more than just oncology studies, that it can be used more widely?
Yes, thank you very much, Liz, and thanks, Matt, for asking. I was one of the people asking the question about teletrials. So teletrials started really in the oncology space, but
you might have to turn your video off to answer, John, because your noise is a little bit tinny, sorry.
That's okay. Is that any better?
It's a bit better, yeah.
Okay, sorry about this. So COSE has been running a project around teletrials, which has involved industry, it's involved consumers, it's involved health departments, it's involved the cooperative trials group. So a number of groups have been involved. A set of SOPs have been developed, and these are slowly rolling out across the country, and the SOPs are not oncology specific. The COSE project is coming to an end in September. And however, ACTA, the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, will be taking up the issue of teletrials more broadly across all the disciplines, so not just oncology, learning from what's already been done, and hopefully making this mainstream across the country. I'm pretty confident that we'll see this in the next year or two. Teletrials will become the norm. And suffice to say, when we talk to cooperative trials groups now, they routinely, many of them, when a new trial comes on for a trials group, they routinely ask the question, is this suitable for a teletrial? And a number of sites around Australia are now asking themselves, when a trial comes to them, could we run this as a teletrial?
That's great to know. I just wondered if either Richard or Sarah had experience with the teletrials model and had any comments to make.
Look, I think from our point of view, we're starting to see it, and I think it's a good thing, because I think we just need to get, as I talked about it with Kate, which essentially she almost became a teletrial patient, and we just need, there's some lumps and bumps that we need to address around the care of the patient as they get more remote, and their sort of primary healthcare provider needs to be more in the loop. Those are the sorts of things that I think that are starting to resonate with me, and I think they would make a huge difference. But in fairness, if we end up with a good national teletrials model, then it's absolutely down to the incredible work of John and Sabe Sarbason, who've driven it through COSA, and it's extraordinary that we're sitting here with a workable protocol that we can roll out across the country, and it's all down to Jay-Z and Sabe. So kudos.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, so we have already used the model, and we do continue to look for sites that can use it. But there are some, like Richard said, there are some barriers that we need to overcome. But the national model should help a fair few of those, and so then hopefully we could use it for more trials moving forward.
Great. Another question, and this might be something, John, you might have some information on, or others. Is there any information on how many patients actually withdrew themselves from clinical trials because of COVID-19?
Yeah, I saw that question. I'm afraid I don't know of any data, and I don't know the answer. I honestly don't know. Sorry.
I think there was some anecdotal information that people had withdrawn from clinical trials. One of the things I think was important in your study, in your data, Richard, and it goes to, John's data, but it goes to Richard's question, is routine care stopping. And we saw an absolute drop in pathology testing, clinic visits, diagnoses of certain diseases, continuity of chronic disease care. And I don't know that it was all to do with imposed restrictions. I think there was a community anxiety that fed those fears of going to the doctor or getting tests done. So I think there are some lessons there about the importance of continuing care, even when you are facing such things as a crisis. So I just wanted to go back to you, Richard, and say, you said in your, and I think it is it may be seen as a true statement, but it's also quite a challenging statement. Suspending recruitment on a clinical trial is a denial of care. Who can be responsible for that? Because we did see in the current setting that those decisions weren't necessarily made by the clinical trial investigators or the sponsors of the clinical trials. They were made by the health service or the hospital itself. And so how do we change that? Yeah,
I think we've got to. I think there's this perception that a clinical trial is a piece of research that okay, we can just suspend this piece of research right now, and I could imagine as a hospital administrator saying, well, let's reduce the risk of COVID, so let's stop this unnecessary traffic coming in. And as always, I think it's a combination of us as patient groups making that point, and it's really something that's only percolated to the top of my head over the last few months. But I think it's also something that where clinicians need to think about what they're doing a little differently. It's not. It's just the nature of the way that the only way, and I'm only talking about cancer, but I suspect it's probably just as valid anywhere else, is that the only way that people are going to be able to access the latest therapies when they have no further options is on clinical trials. And that's a different way of seeing a clinical trial, and we need to get that out there, and we need to start talking about it. And I think we need to think about it as a group of saying, well, was that really the right thing to do? Was there another way to do it? Would you have done it, as I said in the talk? Would you have done it? You didn't just stop an existing cancer patient on a normal standard of care from coming into a hospital. So maybe, and that includes all of those people making those decisions need to be challenged on it, not in an inappropriate way, but just saying it's not what you think it is anymore. It's standard of care.
Liz, could I just comment on that? I guess I made comment about these pandemic response plans that are in place, which I'm sure are being rapidly revised. I just wondered to what extent the consumer voice has been incorporated in a lot of those pandemic response plans. And it really, I think look, the day of patient groups waiting for people to come and talk to them, I think is over. We just you can't rely on that occurring. It's only over because I think it's failed. What needs to happen is the patient groups need to come forward and say, you need to listen to what we've got to say. And I think I would be surprised to the extent that the consumer voice has figured very much in those pandemic plans. But that's an example of where we've got to be proactive around the importance of the consumer voice.
It's a really good point, John, and it's one of the things that we can, and I know Petrina will be thinking about this, that we can perhaps assist with as a sector and an industry to support the patient voice in these kind of things where possible. One of the comments that is on the chat that I think is really important, it goes again to the points that you have all made about the role of clinical trials are not optional. It's not optional research. For some, it is the only option. It is their only standard of care. And is there the likelihood that the government, whether it's state or federal, will see clinical trials as an essential service or a standard of care? And if not, what do we do about that?
Can I take that?
Yes, please, Richard.
I think there's a number of ways that when I went through the ways that we can see clinical trials, I had my pen over the note that I made, and the one that I didn't speak about was the economic impact of clinical trials. I mean, I'll give you a parallel that we talk about. The Prime Minister came out recently and announced that he was spending $400 million on funding the film industry with the possibility of creating 8,000 jobs. It would be interesting to see, and those 8,000 jobs will be, they'll be good jobs. But if we could find a way to invest in the clinical trial community and industry and encourage people like Novartis, who are already doing a lot of work here, to spend more time here, then we have those three words that I hesitate to use, but we potentially have jobs and growth, which we're all going to need. But most importantly, we have another word at the front of that. We have smart jobs and growth. And I think we need to be thinking about how we do that. And we need to be making that case, and we're trying to do something about that right now. But we need people to understand that a buoyant clinical trial community works on so many levels. It increases the competence of our clinicians. It increases our body of scientific knowledge. It creates jobs. It creates growth. It brings multinational corporations into the country to provide investment. But at the peak of it all, it provides potentially better care for Australians living with whatever disease it is. So I think there's a really strong case.
Thanks, Richard. John?
Can I comment, if there's time, just to say
there's 1 minute.
Okay, very quickly, my sense is that the pendulum is swinging. Within ACTA, we say that the way that clinical trials are the way we practice medicine, not just for cancer, but for all diseases. there are reference groups about embedding research into routine healthcare and the routine implementation of clinical trial results. So I do think this is changing, but it does require continued reinforcement.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. I'm sorry we didn't get to every question. There's just one additional comment, and I think it's reflecting communication. Telehealth doesn't work for everybody. And I think also not everybody, regardless of where they live, necessarily knows that they can have access to a clinical trial. So I think there's also a piece in there about communication, whether it's from patients, from clinicians, from governments, from industry, about how to make these clinical trials and our healthcare system the best it can be. We have run out of time. I would like to give my gracious thanks to three fabulous speakers. Sarah Looms from Novartis, Richard Vines from Rare Cancers Australia, and John Zaupberg, Professor from Acknowledgements. Thank you all so much for your time. I encourage people to connect with Katrina if you have anything you'd like us to follow up, and we will make a recording of this panel session available, and we look forward to speaking with you all again soon. Thanks very much, everybody.
Very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.